I thought we were just meeting Ava and Ryan for another fun double date. Drinks, laughs, the usual catching up. But when Ava leaned in, her voice low and teasing, and asked, "Have you ever wondered what it would feel like to break all the rules?" everything changed in an instant. Josh and I had always been the couple who thrived on spontaneity. Married for 6 years, we lived for the thrill of the unexpected, last-minute road trips, adventurous dinner choices, and late-night karaoke that was more passion than talent. Our relationship had always been built on trust and a shared sense of adventure, qualities we cherished as the foundation of our bond. Then there were Ava and Ryan. We met them 3 years ago at a mutual friend's party and instantly clicked. Married for 5 years, they were so much like us, lovers of spontaneity, quick wit, and the kind of humor that could make even the dullest nights unforgettable. Over time, casual meetups turned into regular traditions, game nights, camping trips, and dinners where laughter flowed as freely as the wine. That night at the bar felt no different at first. The familiar hum of conversation, the low lighting, and the faint clinking of glasses created the perfect backdrop for another easy evening. We shared stories, teased each other, and reveled in the comfort of a friendship that felt effortless. But looking back, the tension in the air had been there all along, subtle yet impossible to ignore. Josh and I sat across from Ava and Ryan, exchanging playful banter. Ava, always the bold one, was more animated than usual, her laughter a touch louder, her glances sharper. Ryan, ever the steady counterpart, sat with an easy confidence, his arm draped casually over the back of her chair. They were the couple we always admired, unshakable, confident, and as in sync as we were. Or so I thought. It wasn't until Ava leaned in, her tone dropping to something almost conspiratorial, that the night began to change. Her question, provocative and unexpected, landed like a spark in a room already primed for a fire. For a moment, the easy laughter faltered, replaced by a charged silence. It was the kind of question that made you realize the ground beneath you was far less solid than you'd assumed. The perfect, carefree evening we'd anticipated began to shift into something else entirely, leaving me to wonder, had we crossed into uncharted territory, or had we been on this path all along without realizing it?
The air in the bar felt heavier after Ava's question, like we had stumbled into a conversation none of us were fully prepared for. Josh shifted in his seat beside me, his hand brushing mine under the table. It was a subtle movement, but I felt the unspoken question in his touch. What do we do now? Ava's mischievous grin lingered, her eyes darting between Josh and me as if daring us to respond. "Relax," she said, her voice light but with an edge that betrayed her intent. "It's just a thought. Haven't you ever wondered what it would be like to step out of your comfort zone?" Ryan, sitting beside her, remained quiet. His fingers tapped lightly against his glass, a rhythm I hadn't noticed before. He wasn't looking at Ava. His gaze was fixed on the table, his jaw tightening with each passing second. It was subtle, but it didn't go unnoticed. I couldn't help but wonder. Was this question really as spontaneous as Ava made it seem? Josh, ever the calm one, finally broke the silence. "I think we all wonder about breaking the rules sometimes," he said, his tone measured, his words carefully chosen. "But it's not the kind of thing you can just dive into without thinking." Ava's laughter was soft, almost teasing. "Of course not. That's why we're just talking about it, right? No harm in a little curiosity." But there was harm, wasn't there? Because even as we laughed and brushed off the weight of her words, the tension between us grew. Every glance, every slight pause in the conversation felt loaded with meaning. I noticed the way Ava leaned toward Josh, her smile lingering a second longer than it should have. And Josh, he wasn't pulling away. He wasn't leaning in either, but the flicker of something in his expression, a curiosity he didn't voice, sent a shiver down my spine. I told myself I was imagining it, that I was reading too much into innocent gestures. But doubt had already crept in, and it wasn't leaving. And then there was Ryan. Quiet, brooding Ryan, who suddenly seemed like he was holding back more than just his words. His fingers never stopped moving, tracing the condensation on his glass, his gaze distant yet watchful. It felt like he was waiting for something, maybe for Ava to say too much, or for one of us to shut the conversation down. The evening dragged on, each passing minute feeling like an eternity. The laughter felt forced now, the easy rhythm of our friendship replaced by a dance of glances and unsaid words. I could feel the cracks forming, not just between Ava and Ryan, but between all of us. When Ava excused herself to go to the bathroom, Ryan finally spoke, his voice low and sharp. "She means well," he said, his eyes fixed on his glass. "But she doesn't always think things through." Josh raised an eyebrow, his tone careful. "Is this something you've talked about before?" Ryan hesitated, the briefest pause that told me everything I needed to know. "We've talked," he admitted, his voice tight. "But I didn't expect her to bring it up tonight." I didn't know what to say, so I stayed silent, my mind racing. Had this been their plan all along? Were Josh and I just pawns in something Ava and Ryan had already decided? By the time Ava returned, the atmosphere was so tense it was suffocating. She sat down, oblivious, or pretending to be, about the shift that had taken place in her absence. "So," she said with a playful grin, "where were we?" Josh and I exchanged a glance, both of us feeling the same unease. We were no longer sure where this night was headed, but one thing was clear. The trust we'd always shared with Ava and Ryan was starting to feel dangerously fragile. By the time the drinks arrived, the mood at the table had shifted into uncharted territory. Ava's earlier suggestion wasn't just a passing remark anymore. It had grown roots, tangling itself into every word, every glance, and every moment of silence. I could feel it in the way Josh avoided meeting my eyes, in the way Ava leaned into every word he said, her laughter just a little too loud, her touch lingering on the table just a little too long. "So, have you ever pushed the boundaries before?" Ava asked, her voice soft and curious, as if she were asking about a favorite movie rather than something that could unravel everything we'd built. Josh hesitated, swirling the whiskey in his glass. "Depends on what you mean by boundaries," he said carefully, his tone low but steady. Ryan, sitting stiffly beside Ava, watched him intently. It was subtle, but his jaw tightened just enough to show he wasn't entirely on board with the direction this was going. "Pushing boundaries can mean a lot of things," he said, his voice neutral but carrying an edge. "Some lines are easier to cross than others." Ava shrugged, brushing off his remark with a flick of her hand. "I'm just saying it's worth talking about. We're all so close. Doesn't it make you curious?" Her eyes flicked to me then, her smile widening. "You must have thought about it, right, Rachel?" I froze, my heart racing. The truth was I hadn't, not in any serious way. But now that Ava had brought it up, the question hung in the air like a dare I couldn't ignore. "I think curiosity is normal," I said carefully, trying to keep my voice neutral. "But talking about it is one thing. Acting on it is something else." Ava tilted her head, her gaze sharpening. "But isn't curiosity where it all starts?" I glanced at Josh, hoping for reassurance, but his expression was unreadable. He was always the calm one, the one who could navigate any situation without letting his emotions show. But this time, his silence felt like betrayal, like he wasn't standing on the same side as me anymore. "Maybe," Josh said finally, his voice quiet but firm. "But some things are better left unexplored." Ava's grin faltered just for a moment, but she recovered quickly, leaning back in her chair. "Fair enough. No harm in a little conversation, though, right?" Ryan cleared his throat, breaking the tension. "It's just talk," he said, though his tone suggested otherwise. He wasn't looking at Ava anymore. His gaze was fixed on the table, his fingers tracing the edge of his glass. For the first time, I noticed how tense he was, how every muscle in his body seemed coiled, ready to snap. The conversation shifted after that, but the tension lingered. Ava became quieter, though her eyes stayed sharp, darting between Josh and me like she was waiting for one of us to crack. Ryan kept his head down, speaking only when prompted, his responses clipped and neutral. And Josh, he was the hardest to read. He kept his voice steady, his words measured, but I could feel the shift in him, the weight of something unspoken pressing between us. It wasn't until Ava leaned forward again, her voice dropping to a near whisper, that the conversation veered back to dangerous ground. "Look," she said, her eyes locking on Josh. "We're not saying you have to do anything crazy. But imagine how close we could all be if we just explored the idea. No pressure, no expectations. Just curiosity." Ryan sighed audibly, rubbing a hand over his face. "Ava, maybe we should drop it." But Ava ignored him, her gaze never wavering from Josh. And to my horror, Josh didn't look away. There was something in his expression I hadn't seen before. A flicker of interest, a spark of something I couldn't quite place. My stomach twisted, and I forced myself to speak, to break whatever spell Ava was trying to cast. "I think we're all getting ahead of ourselves," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. "Maybe we should call it a night." Josh turned to me then, his expression softening. "You're right," he said, reaching for my hand under the table. But his grip didn't feel reassuring this time. It felt like an apology, like he knew he'd let the conversation go too far. Ava sat back, her smile fading into something more neutral, almost unreadable. Of course, she said, her tone light but carrying a hint of disappointment. It's just a thought, after all. Ryan pushed his chair back abruptly, standing before anyone else could say a word. I'll get the check, he said, his tone clipped. Ava opened her mouth to protest, but he silenced her with a glance. As Ryan walked away, Ava's eyes lingered on him, her expression darkening. For the first time all night, she looked unsure, her confidence cracking just enough to show something deeper, something she was trying desperately to hide. Josh and I exchanged a glance, and in that moment, I knew we weren't just dealing with curiosity anymore. This was something much bigger, something that could change everything if we weren't careful. The car ride home was heavy with silence. Josh kept his eyes on the road, one hand gripping the steering wheel tighter than usual. My arms were crossed as I stared out the window, the streetlights casting fleeting patterns across my face. I wanted to ask him what he was thinking, to demand he explain the way he'd looked at Ava tonight, but I couldn't bring myself to break the quiet. Finally, Josh spoke, his voice low and careful. That was unexpected. I turned to him, my heart pounding. Unexpected? You barely pushed back, Josh. You let her keep going like it didn't bother you. It didn't bother me, he said too quickly, his knuckles whitening on the wheel. I just didn't think escalating things would help. Escalating things? I repeated, incredulous. She was practically throwing herself at you, and you just sat there. Josh sighed, glancing at me briefly before turning back to the road. I didn't want to make it awkward. For everyone. It's already awkward, I snapped. They're clearly dealing with something, and now we're caught in the middle of it. Josh didn't respond, and his silence only fueled the fire inside me. I wanted him to admit that Ava had crossed a line, that her words had made him uncomfortable. But deep down, I wasn't sure that was true. The way he'd looked at her, the way he hadn't shut her down, it felt like a betrayal, even if he hadn't technically done anything wrong. When we got home, I kicked off my shoes and headed straight for the kitchen, pouring myself a glass of water to steady my nerves. Josh followed, leaning against the counter with his arms crossed. Can we talk about this? He asked, his tone calmer now. Talk about what? I said, setting the glass down with a little too much force. The fact that Ava is obviously trying to push boundaries, or the fact that you didn't seem to mind. That's not fair, he said, his voice rising slightly. I didn't encourage her. You didn't stop her either, I shot back. You let her keep talking like it was some harmless game. Josh opened his mouth to argue, but before he could, his phone buzzed on the counter. We both glanced at the screen, and my heart sank when I saw the name. Ava. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the phone, before finally picking it up. It's late, he muttered, hitting decline. What does she want now? I demanded, crossing my arms. I don't know, he said, setting the phone face down on the counter. Probably to smooth things over. Smooth things over, I repeated bitterly. Or keep pushing to see how far she can take this. Josh sighed, running a hand through his hair. You're reading too much into this. Am I? I challenged. Because it feels like she's been testing us for a while now. And tonight, she finally decided to see if we'd take the bait. He didn't respond, and his silence only deepened the knot in my stomach. I turned away, gripping the edge of the counter to steady myself. If she messages you again, I want to know, I said, my voice shaking. No secrets, Josh. If we're going to deal with this, we have to be honest with each other. I agree, he said quietly. No secrets. The next morning, I woke to another message from Ava, this time sent to both Josh and me in a group chat. Ava. Hey, I just wanted to apologize if I made things uncomfortable last night. Ryan and I have been going through some stuff, and I think I might have let that spill over. Can we talk? I really value our friendship, and I don't want to lose it. Josh read the message over my shoulder, his expression unreadable. What do you think? He asked. I hesitated, unsure how to respond. Ava's words sounded sincere, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more she wasn't saying. I think she's trying to save face, I said finally. But maybe we owe it to them to hear her out. Later that day, we met Ava and Ryan at a nearby park. The tension was palpable as we sat on a bench, the four of us facing each other like rivals about to negotiate a truce. Ava was the first to speak. I'm sorry, she said, her eyes sincere. I wasn't trying to cross any lines. I guess I've been feeling stuck lately, and I thought maybe talking about something new might help. Ryan's jaw tightened, but he didn't interrupt. His silence spoke volumes, though. This wasn't the first time Ava had pushed too far. We appreciate the apology, I said carefully, glancing at Josh. But I think we all need to be honest about what's really going on here. Ava, were you just talking, or were you hoping for something more? Ava's cheeks flushed, and for the first time, she looked unsure of herself. I don't know, she admitted. Maybe a part of me was curious. But I wasn't trying to hurt anyone. Ryan finally spoke then, his voice low but firm. Curiosity is one thing, Ava, but you can't just drag other people into our problems because you're restless. Ava's head snapped toward him, her eyes narrowing. Our problems? You mean your inability to communicate? And just like that, the conversation spiraled into an argument between them. Josh and I sat in stunned silence as years of unresolved tension spilled out, their voices growing louder and more accusatory with every passing second. It became clear that their suggestion wasn't about curiosity or boundaries. It was a desperate attempt to distract themselves from their own crumbling relationship. Finally, Josh stood, his voice cutting through their argument. Enough, he said firmly. You two need to figure this out on your own. Don't drag us into it. Ava and Ryan fell silent, their anger replaced by a mix of embarrassment and guilt. You're right, Ava said quietly. We need to deal with this, just the two of us. As Josh and I walked back to the car, I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. Relief that we hadn't crossed a line we couldn't come back from, but sadness for the friendship that might never be the same. Josh took my hand, his grip steady and reassuring. We did the right thing, he said. I nodded, though the weight of the night still lingered. Ava and Ryan's cracks had been exposed, but they'd also forced us to confront our own vulnerabilities. And while we hadn't crossed any lines, I couldn't help but wonder how close we'd come. The days following that night felt heavy. Josh and I avoided discussing it, as if silence might erase the tension that had seeped into our relationship. But it didn't. The echoes of Ava's words, the looks exchanged at the bar, and the argument in the park lingered like a storm cloud, refusing to dissipate. For the first time in our marriage, I felt like I couldn't fully read Josh. He went about his day as usual, but there was a distance in his eyes, a hesitancy in his voice. I couldn't stop myself from replaying every moment from that night, analyzing his reactions, Ava's smiles, and Ryan's growing frustration. Were they really just testing us, or had they been testing each other all along? Ava texted me again a few days later, her message as polished as always. Ava, hey Rachel, I hope you and Josh are doing okay. Ryan and I had a long talk, and I think we're starting to figure things out. I miss you guys. Let's catch up soon? I stared at the message, unsure of how to respond. What did she say? Josh asked from across the room, his tone neutral. I handed him my phone, watching his face as he read the text. His expression didn't give much away, but I caught the slight furrow in his brow. What do you want to do? He asked, handing the phone back. I don't know, I admitted. I don't think I'm ready to see them yet. Josh nodded, his eyes dropping to the floor. Me neither. For the first time, it felt like we were on the same page, not just about Ava and Ryan, but about everything. That realization should have been comforting, but it wasn't. Because if we were avoiding them, it wasn't just because of what they'd done. It was because of what their suggestion had exposed in us. Cracks we hadn't even realized were there. Late one night, Josh finally broke the silence. We were sitting on the couch, the TV playing softly in the background, though neither of us was watching it. Do you think we're like them? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I looked at him, startled by the question. What do you mean? Do you think we're trying to find something outside of us because something's missing here? His words hit me like a punch to the gut, not because they felt untrue, but because I'd been wondering the same thing. No, I said firmly, though my voice wavered. I think we're different. Ava and Ryan were looking for a way to distract themselves from their problems. We're not them. Josh nodded slowly, but his eyes were clouded with doubt. Then why did it feel like maybe they weren't completely wrong? The weight of his question hung between us, and I didn't have an answer. I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that our marriage was solid, that Ava's suggestion had been nothing more than an uncomfortable diversion. But I couldn't, because deep down I knew the truth. Their words had sparked something in both of us, a curiosity we didn't want to acknowledge. Over the next few weeks, Josh and I made a conscious effort to focus on each other. We planned date nights, went on long walks, and talked more than we had in months. It wasn't always easy. There were moments when the tension between us bubbled to the surface, threatening to break through. But we pushed through it. Slowly, we began to feel like ourselves again. Meanwhile, Ava and Ryan seemed to be on their own path of reconciliation, or destruction. I couldn't tell which. The few times Ava reached out, her messages were upbeat, almost painfully so, as if she were trying to convince herself that everything was fine. But Ryan never called, never texted. And every time I thought about them, I felt a pang of sadness for the friendship we might have lost. It wasn't until a month later that we saw them again. Ava invited us over for dinner, insisting it would be casual and just like old times. I hesitated, unsure if I was ready to face them, but Josh surprised me by agreeing. When we arrived, it was clear that things were far from just like old times. Ava's smile was tight, her laughter forced. Ryan barely spoke, his responses curt and his gaze distant. The warmth that had once defined our friendship was gone, replaced by an unspoken tension none of us seemed willing to address. As we sat around the table, Ava made a half-hearted attempt to revive the camaraderie we'd once shared. She joked about old camping trips and game nights, but the laughter that followed felt hollow. Ryan excused himself early, muttering something about work, and Ava didn't even try to stop him. After we left, Josh and I sat in the car, the silence between us heavy but no longer strained. "They're not going to make it, are they?" I asked, my voice quiet. Josh shook his head. "I don't think so." I nodded, a lump forming in my throat. "I don't think we can keep pretending everything's fine with them." "We don't have to," Josh said, reaching for my hand. "But we can still be there for them if they need us." That night, as we lay in bed, I realized that the fallout from Ava and Ryan's suggestion had done more than strain our friendship. It had forced us to confront the cracks in our own relationship. And while it hadn't been easy, it had made us stronger. Because unlike Ava and Ryan, we'd chosen to face those cracks together, rather than letting them pull us apart. In the weeks that followed our strained dinner with Ava and Ryan, life slowly began to settle back into its familiar rhythm. Josh and I returned to our routines, focusing on each other and the quiet comfort of our life together. But something had shifted. We weren't just going through the motions anymore. We were intentionally reconnecting, rebuilding the trust and closeness we'd nearly taken for granted. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, Josh broke the silence. "I've been thinking a lot about everything that happened," he said, his voice calm but serious. "About Ava and Ryan, about us." I turned to him, my chest tightening. And I realized how easy it is to let small cracks grow into something bigger, he said. What happened with them, it wasn't just about curiosity or boundaries. It was about avoiding what was already broken. I nodded, the truth of his words settling heavily between us. "They were looking for an escape," I said softly. "But we don't need an escape, do we?" Josh reached for my hand, his grip warm and steady. "No, we don't. If anything, this whole thing made me realize how much I value what we have. It's not perfect, but it's ours. And that's enough for me." Hearing him say that, I felt a weight lift from my chest. For weeks, I'd carried the fear that maybe the cracks in our relationship were deeper than I thought. But Josh's words were like a bomb, reminding me that love isn't about avoiding imperfections. It's about choosing each other despite them. As for Ava and Ryan, their story took a different path. Ava reached out a few more times, her messages filled with cheerful updates and invitations to meet up. But Ryan's absence in those conversations spoke volumes. It wasn't long before I heard through a mutual friend that they'd decided to separate. Their once unshakable bond had finally fractured under the weight of unspoken resentment and unmet expectations. It was hard not to feel guilty, wondering if we'd played some part in their unraveling. But Josh reminded me that their problems had existed long before we entered the picture. "You can't fix what someone else is running from," he said one night, and I realized he was right. Ava and Ryan's struggles weren't ours to solve. Still, their experience served as a powerful reminder of the fragility of relationships. Josh and I began to talk more openly, addressing things we might have let slide before. We set aside time to be together, really be together, not just as partners but as friends, confidants, and equals. And slowly, we rediscovered the joy in the little things. Lazy Sunday mornings, shared laughter over inside jokes, and the simple comfort of being with someone who truly knows you. One day, I found myself scrolling through old photos of the four of us, camping trips, game nights, dinners filled with laughter and wine. The memories were bittersweet, a reminder of a friendship that had once felt so effortless. I sent a message to Ava, letting her know I was thinking of her. She replied quickly, her words upbeat but tinged with sadness. "Thank you, Rachel. I'm doing okay. It's been tough, but I think it's for the best." It was the last time we spoke. Looking back, I realized that the night Ava posed her provocative question wasn't just the start of a difficult chapter. It was also a turning point. It forced Josh and me to confront the things we'd been neglecting, to reevaluate what we truly wanted from each other and from our life together. And in doing so, it brought us closer in ways I hadn't thought possible. As I sat beside Josh on the couch one evening, I leaned my head against his shoulder and let out a contented sigh. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" He smiled, pressing a kiss to the top of my head. "Yeah, we have. And I wouldn't change a thing. Because in the end, we learned the most important lesson of all. Love isn't about perfection. It's about choosing each other every day, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. And while some doors are better left unopened, the ones that lead to deeper understanding and connection are always worth walking through. Together. What would you have done if you were in our position? Would you take the risk to explore, or would you choose to hold on to what you have? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And if this story resonated with you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more emotional and thought-provoking stories. There's so much more to come. Stay tuned.